Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're basically playing the role of historical detectives. We're going to sift through the dust of the 1st and 2nd centuries to figure out exactly what ancient, completely non-Christian sources actually say about Jesus and his earliest followers. We'll separate what's proven, what's just implied, and what is frankly fiercely debated. So, what does history actually say when we take the Bible completely out of the equation? We're looking strictly at secular Roman and Jewish records from the 1st and 2nd centuries. If we take the New Testament entirely off the table, what kind of historical footprint is actually left behind? It's a fascinating puzzle, and it forces us to look at some of the most hyper-analyzed fragments of text in human history. Moving on to Section 1, the search for evidence, the non-Christian records. Now, our investigation starts with a pretty glaring gap. During the actual lifetime of Jesus, the secular Roman archives are just completely silent. Nothing. Because of this, we have to neutrally examine the skeptical view championed by figures like the 19th century German scholar Bruno Bauer. He pointed out a really profound detail that historians still grapple with today. There are literally 0 surviving historic records about Jesus of Nazareth from any non-Jewish author until the 2nd century. For proponents of the Christ myth theory, this gap is huge. To them, it suggests that Jesus might have been an amalgamation of ancient mythologies rather than an actual flesh-and-blood person. Just look at this timeline. You can really see how this builds up. The execution under Pilate happens around 30 CE, right? Then we have the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CL. But the major Roman histories, they aren't even written until the 90s and the 110 CE. That's a massive gap. We're relying on historians who are looking backward, piecing things together from state archives, rumors, and older, lost accounts. Which brings us to Section 2. The Roman historians speak. Clues from Tacitus and Suetonius. To help fill in that historical gap, we're calling our prime witnesses, the highly respected Roman historians Cornelius Tacitus and Suetonius. These guys were Roman senators, totally embedded in the imperial court, and they absolutely despised the early Christian movement. But honestly, their hostility is exactly what makes them such compelling, independent witnesses. The real bombshell is this visceral quote from Tacitus, written around 115 CE in his work called the Annals. It gives us independent confirmation of an execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. For most modern historians, this single sentence right here is the bedrock evidence that a historical Jesus existed and was executed by the Roman state. Then we have Suetonius corroborating all of this. He confirms the existence and the severe persecution of this group under Emperor Nero, and he describes their faith in incredibly harsh terms. Interestingly, he just casually wedges this punishment into a list of Nero's efforts to maintain public order, right between bans on rowdy chariot drivers and pantomime actors. You've probably noticed the word superstition being used by both Tacitus and Suetonius. To Roman authorities, early Christianity wasn't just, a different set of beliefs. It was a superstitio. In their eyes, it was a dangerous, excessive, and frankly mischievous threat to public order, entirely because it operated outside of state-approved religious practice. They viewed it as a bizarre underground sect. Here's Section 3, Investigating the Great Fire, Nero's Scapegoats. So both of our key historians anchor their accounts around one massive catastrophe, the devastating 6-day Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Now, the rumor mill at the time placed the blame squarely on Emperor Nero himself. People thought he started it so he could rebuild the city however he wanted. Tacitus vividly describes how Nero, feeling the heat, ruthlessly used the highly stigmatized Christians as convenient scapegoats. Tacitus actually details some horrific tortures, like crucifixions and burnings, but he also notes that even though the Christians were widely hated, Nero's sheer over-the-top cruelty actually started to generate some public compassion for them. Up next, Section 4, Forgery or Fact, the cross-examination. But like any good detective story, the evidence isn't exactly open and shut. It's heavily contested, which leads us to a really fierce academic debate over authenticity. Could that incredibly vital passage from Tacitus actually be a later Christian insertion? Well, the orthodox historical consensus says no, pointing to the extremely hostile tone as proof. They argue that a Christian forger would never invent such a disparaging description of their own people. But skeptics like Richard Carrier completely disagree. They argue it might very well be a much later Christian interpolation. They point out that absolutely no Christian author quoted this amazing piece of evidence for hundreds of years. It only appears fully formed much later in the Chronicles of Sulpicius Severus. Check out this list of specific anomalies that skeptics are quick to point out. The big one here is the title. Would a meticulous Roman archivist like Tacitus really mistake Pilate's official title of prefect for a procurator? Probably not. On top of that, skeptics argue that the very term Christians might actually be anachronistic for the year 64 CE. It just doesn't quite fit the timeline perfectly. And then we have to decode this fascinating spelling mystery found in the earliest manuscripts. They use the word Christus instead of Christus. Why does that matter? Well, Christus was actually a super common name for Roman slaves. It basically meant good or useful. So the question becomes, were Tacitus and later Suetonius confusing the title of Christ with just some local agitator named Christus? This exact spelling issue takes center stage in Suetonius' account of Emperor Claudius from the year 49 CE, and it leaves historians completely split. Is Suetonius describing early Christians causing theological riots within the Jewish community of Rome, or is he literally just talking about a completely unknown local instigator named Christus who just happened to be alive and causing trouble in Rome at that exact same time? It's a massive historical coin toss. All right, moving to section 5, clues from other cultures, corroborating the Roman accounts. Because those Roman texts are so fiercely debated, we absolutely have to cross-reference our findings with clues from other cultures. I mean, a good historical detective never relies on just a single witness, right? We actually find secondary clues scattered all across ancient literature. You've got the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 90s CE, who specifically mentions the execution of Jesus and even references his brother James. Then there's Pliny the Younger, writing to Emperor Trajan around 111 CE, asking for legal advice on how to legally execute Christians. We even have rabbinic traditions in the Talmud, noting a hanging on Passover Eve. Plus, there are fragments from a historian named Thales, who allegedly tried to explain away the darkness during the crucifixion as just a standard solar eclipse. To really grasp how complicated this is, let's look at a visual breakdown. If you were to create an infographic based on all this information, accompanied by these timelines, you'd immediately see the intense academic footnoting required just to track these references. Translating and authenticating these ancient puzzle pieces is an incredibly complex task. Every single word we read today has been filtered through centuries of copying, translation, and potential tampering by much later scribes who had their own specific agendas. Section 6. The verdict of history. The modern consensus. So after weighing all the Roman documents, the skeptical arguments, and the corroborating texts, where do we land? Well, we arrive at the generally accepted verdict of modern historians. While the Christ myth theory definitely exists and has its supporters, the overwhelming majority of scholars agree on a basic historical core. Despite the endless debates over exact wording, these completely independent, secular sources actually align on a historical baseline. Just look at the cross-cultural consensus here. Both the Roman Tacitus and the Jewish Josephus independently confirm an execution under Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, which led to a movement that faced immense pushback. However, we have to be really precise here. We must carefully distinguish between what these texts definitively prove regarding the existence and suffering of the early movement versus the theological implications that they leave entirely unanswered. History can absolutely prove a man died on a Roman cross, but history cannot, using these secular sources alone anyway, prove what happened 3 days later. All of this leaves us to ponder something really profound. Considering the fragmented, heavily debated nature of these ancient secular clues, where a single misspelled Latin word can literally shift the entire historical consensus, does piecing together the true story of the past always require its own kind of faith? I'll let you be the judge of that. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning and keep learning.